Hey everybody, this is Games Plus James, and today we're going to take a look at adding a loading screen and loading bars into your game. Now, why do we want to do this? Well, I'll give a good demonstration of why here. If I just play my scene here, I've got a simple scene that just rotates around these objects, and if I go to load into my next scene by pressing a button, you can see we immediately freeze up. And it's going to take a while to load into my next scene because it's quite a big scene. And if your players are playing your game and they encounter this, where the whole game is just freezing up for a while they're trying to go ahead and jump in and play, obviously what that's going to lead to is your players saying, oh no, I don't want to play this game anymore. It keeps crashing, it keeps freezing for no reason. So you don't want this going on. So we use loading screens and loading bars and things like that to hide those transitions and make it a lot more useful to the player by giving them feedback about what's happening. So I'm going to stop this running here, and I'm going to create a loading screen to hide when we are loading our game. So on the very basic level, I have a canvas here. I can go to right click on this and add a UI image, and I'm going to make this a nice black image like this. If I zoom in, so make sure I'm in 2D view looking at this, and if I stretch this out to the full size of my canvas, there we go. We've got a nice black screen hiding everything. Then we can add a bit of text. Well, actually, I'm going to change the name of this to be loading screen. First of all, I can right click here and add a bit of UI text that will just make this say loading ... Actually, we'll make this all capitalized, loading ... I'm going to make this white so it stands out, and then I'm going to click and drag this like this. I'm going to put it in the bottom corner. We're going to change the size to be nice and big like so. Okay, so we've got a nice little loading bit of text here in the bottom corner, so that's fine. So let's make it so that this screen appears when we load into a new scene. So as I said, I've got a very simple script. If I open it up here, literally all it does is just you press a key and it'll load into that scene. So we want to display our bit of a loading screen that we just made. So obviously we're going to need a reference to that. So we'll create a public game object loading screen. And then just before the level loads, we'll say loading screen dot set active true. So let's save this. We'll jump back into Unity. Once that compiles, we'll get a slot here for the loading screen. So let's drop the loading screen in there. Then if I press play now, this time when I press L, there we go. We get a nice little loading, and the player knows that something is happening. At least the game isn't just freezing. But if you've got a really long load, as this is a bit of a long load here, when it's just sitting on this screen, that's not really great. This isn't good for the player. They don't get a nice feedback by having this loading screen popping up, because now I'm sitting here for a while, and in all that time, I don't know, has my game crashed? Am I just stuck on this loading screen? Nobody knows. So we need to give some more feedback than just a simple bit of text like that. What's good is to have something animated happening. And I believe on the PlayStation, that's a requirement that your games doesn't have a static screen where there's no feedback being given to the player. You have to have something animated on a loading screen like that so the player knows the game hasn't frozen. So with that in mind, let's very easily go to our canvas. I'm going to turn the loading screen back on. I'm going to right click, add a UI image, and then in my art folder I've got a very simple little rotating logo here, so I'm going to add that in there. I'm going to move, I'm going to zoom in a bit and move this over to here. Then I'm going to add a very simple animation to this. So in my animation tab here, I'm just going to create loading spinner. And this is very easy using the files I have. It's just drag and drop this simple animation into place. Now you can do anything for your animation. You could have just a single image bouncing up and down, or you could have a person running around, or anything. You could do whatever you want basically on this loading screen. But generally speaking, you don't want it to be too interactive with your players. So now if I press play, you can see we've got a nice little spinning animation. Okay, so how do we make this show? Well, if we go ahead and play our game now, if I just save this, I will deactivate our loading screen. When we press play, if I go to load, oh, well, what's going on here? We've got our little loading animation, but it's not doing anything. We've got our loading screen up. But what's happening is the exact thing that was happening before we actually made this loading screen, where the game would hitch up for a brief amount of time while it loads. We're having the same thing happen here because, as far as Unity is concerned, hey, it doesn't matter what's on the screen, I'm trying to load into the next area. So what we need to do is do something slightly different with our loading. So let's go to our script that we have loading. And instead of just loading it straight up here, in our scene-manager.load scene, I'm going to comment this out. And then down the bottom here, we're going to create a new coroutine that will allow us to load our level in the background while our level is still active. So we're going to create a private IEnumerator that we'll call load level async. And we're going to call this up here when we press our L key down. So here we're going to say start coroutine load level async, and then we're going to need some code in here. So why are we doing this? Well, if we do a coroutine like this, which is referred to as IEnumerator here, a coroutine will allow us to carry out this function in the background. So we can tell it to load the level in the background, and that will allow us to actually look when the level is loading. It will make sure the game won't actually completely freeze up. We still might get some hitches and a few bumps and jumps in our loading, but it'll be okay because it's actually loading the stuff in the background, and it'll be much better for our players especially. So how do we do this? Well, in our coroutine here, we add a async operation. So async operation means an operation that happens outside the normal flow of time. So outside the normal Unity update, late update, fixed update, and all that stuff. This instead happens on a different timeline, but happens essentially in the background as Unity is working. So async operation that we'll call async load. And I'm going to set that to be equal to a scene manager dot load scene async. And all we have to do then is tell it the name of the level that we want to load. So I have that stored as a string up here. And that's perfectly fine. That's the operation we need to do. But why have we still got this red line here? Well, a coroutine is something that will basically keep going forever. It'll keep going through its operation. And usually how you can make things happen in a consecutive amount of time is you would say maybe yield return new wait for seconds, and you would tell it to wait for 2 seconds and then do something else down here. Who knows what. But we don't want that. We want it to wait for the level to load and then load the level. So what we do is basically just say while async load dot is done is not true. So that's why we said not here. So as long as the async load isn't finished loading, we wanted to tell the coroutine to yield return null. And basically what this just means is don't exit the coroutine. We wanted to keep doing this while loop. It'll keep doing this while loop the whole time as long as our async load is not done. And that's all we need to do for the moment. So we'll save this, we'll jump back into Unity. And once that compiles, we should be able to see when we play the game now and load, we get our loading spinning away just the way we want it to. And then when it's done, we'll load into the next scene. As you can see, we get a couple of little hitches like that, but that's okay because it's just there's literally nothing you can do about that. But it's only a minor couple of little things. But now we getting a bit more feedback to our players. So it's great that the player can see, oh, this loading thing is spinning away. That means it's doing something. But still, if that takes a really long time, it can lead to the player going, oh no, why is this taking so long to load? So we need to give the player a little bit more feedback than that. So what we're going to do is add a bar in for our players to load with. And adding a loading bar is super simple. All we do is go to our loading screen here. I'm going to turn it back on again. And I'm going to go to UI and slider. And I'm going to make this slider nice and big. I'm going to put it down here. Well, I'm not going to make it that tall, but we're going to make it take up a big chunk of the screen here. Then just for the purposes of testing here, I'm going to make my slider go to the middle. And I'm going to remove these images on this slider. So on my background, I'm going to remove the, I don't want to delete the whole background. I want to delete the source image here. And I'm going to make the color be a bit darker. I'm going to completely remove the handle because we don't want our players interacting with the slider. And actually, if we go to the slider here, we want to turn off interactable. Then in the fill area, I'm going to grab the fill and again delete the source image, and we'll put the color, we'll leave the color as it is. Then I'm just going to quickly adjust the position of the edges of our fill here. So I'm going to drag this, snap these into the different positions, and the reason we do this is so that the bar itself will actually fill up our slider completely. So now if I grab our slider and if I move it all the way to the bottom, you see it's all the way empty, and all the way to the top it fills up to the exact edge of the top. Okay, so we've got a very simple bar. So how do we actually update this in our script? Well, we're obviously going to need a reference to it back in our loading script. Sorry, our load screen script here. I'm going to deactivate the load screen as well. Then back in here, we're going to go up to the top. Whenever we want to use any UI elements of Unity, we need to go to unityengine.ui. And then down here, we're going to create a public slider that we'll call load bar, loading bar. And then down here in our async section here, we're going to say, as long as the loading isn't done, set the loading bar dot value to be equal to our async load dot progress. So how much of our async load is done. So let's see this in action. We'll go back in here, wait for it to compile, and we'll add our slider into that slot now. And now when I press play and we load our scene, I'm getting a little bit of hitching up here simply because I'm recording a video at the same time, so this can occasionally happen. But you can see our slider bar did fill up nicely. So it filled up all the way to the top, and then we immediately jumped into our level. Now, what it actually did is something slightly different. I say it filled all the way to the top. It didn't. You might have noticed it did not go all the way to the top. So there we go, nice smooth, and it gets to about here, and then it'll load in the last little bit. So this is great, but what we wanted to do is have a little bit more control of it as a player. We don't want our player to be immediately jumping straight into a level. You'll notice in a lot of games in general, if there's a long load between scenes, you'll allow the player to press a button to load into the next scene. So we want to allow our players to do that, so it'll load up to a certain amount and then continue on to the next area. So to do that, we can jump back into our script, and we can add, just below where we start the async operation, we can say async load, which is the one we just created, async load dot allow scene activation equals false. So what this means is, if I save this and go back in here to Unity and press play, if we go to load here now, it'll fill up the bar. Now it won't actually fill all the way, but it'll get to this certain point, which is roughly 90%. So it'll get to about 90%, and then it'll say, okay, I won't, because we didn't allow scene activation, it won't finish loading. It won't move on to the next amount of scene. Now, the way this works is it'll try to get to 90% and then not do any more. So it won't be exactly 90%, but it'll be roughly 90%. So what we'll do here is, where we're checking if the async load is done, we're updating the value of the bar. Here we're going to say if our async load dot progress is greater than or equal to 0.9. So we're saying if it gets to 90% or a little bit above that, because it'll try to load 90%, but that can't always be exactly accurate. So it'll load to about there. And if we are above that value, then we're going to do a check and see if the player presses any button. So input dot any key down. So if any key is pressed, then we're going to switch it so the async load is true. Or sorry, the allow scene activation is true. So here we can say async load dot allow scene activation equals true. And to make sure we're not doing this repeatedly, we're also going to add in here if our async load progress is greater than 0.9 and the allow scene activation is not true. So not async load dot allow scene activation. Okay, so as long as those things aren't true, then we'll press a button and it'll load into the next scene. So let's go back in here. Let this compile. And we press play. We'll load up. And it'll stop here. It's waiting for my input now. So if I press any button, it should load into the next scene. You kind of hitch up a little bit, and there we go, we've loaded into the next scene. But how did I know to do that? I had no way of really knowing that I should do that. As far as I was concerned, I was still just waiting for it to finish loading. So what we need to do is, first of all, we need to update that little bit of loading text that exists in the corner. If I turn this back on here. So we want to change the bit of loading text to say, hey, press any button to continue. So for that, let's create a reference to it. So public text loading text, and then down here when our async progress gets above 90%, we're going to change it so that loading text dot text equals press any key to continue. So we'll save that, jump back in, and now we should get some more visual feedback going on to tell us what's happening. So now if I press play, if I load up my scene, I left the window active, but that doesn't really matter. Oh, I didn't hook up my things correctly. Hold on. Of course, it's not going to work very well if you don't set these things to work right. So I can go to grab my loading text into there. We'll turn off the screen. Now if I press play, we load up. Once it gets up to the 90% mark again, sometimes it'll hitch up like this just because I'm recording a video. But now we get the nice press any key to continue. And then if I press the button, you can see we get a bit of a freeze, but then we jump into the game. Now we want to hide that little freeze that occurs there. And what we want to do that is simply get the image and the text and the slider bar itself and just hide them. So we'll do that in just a second, but one other really important thing is it doesn't look great when we're loading our game here and it gets up to 90%. So again, it'll jump up now in a second, but we get to our 90% of our bar and we're basically saying, hey, we're not loaded all the way, but press any button and something will happen. So what we do instead is just a little kind of mind trick to our players is, because as far they don't really need to know that it only loads 90% of the game, for example. We're going to set the maximum value here to be 0.9. So now when we play and load in, you can see our bar fills up and it actually fills all the way up. So as far as the player is concerned, hey, we've loaded all the way. Then we press any key and it will load into the next scene. So let's do the final thing, which is to hide those UI elements. So we have references to the text and the slider, but we don't have a reference to the image. So let's create a reference to that in our code. So public game object loading image. And then down here, after we press our any key, so we press our any key, and before we set the allow scene activation to be true, we'll just say loading text dot game object dot set active false. Then the loading bar dot game object dot set active false. And finally loading image. We don't have to say game object because that already isn't game object, so we can just say loading image dot set active false. Okay, let's jump back in. We'll make sure we put our image in that slot. So we'll drag image into here. So now when I press play, now we get a full feeling of, hey, our loading bar fills up to the top. It'll jump up now in a second because again I'm recording, so it acts a bit weird, but now we can press any key and the screen goes black and we load into our scene. So that's how we can create a nice fully functional loading screen in our game. It makes things a lot more interesting for our player. They get direct feedback of what's happening in the game. We get a lot less of those hitches that we have going on in our game in general. And it allows us to give our player bits of information if we want to. You could put on that screen some little tips about the game, or you could put a mini game for loading while you're playing. There's lots of things you can do there, but most importantly, it hides those really ugly hitches where your game is frozen in place. So there you go. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure you hit that like button and don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more Unity tutorials in the very near future. I'm Games Plus James and I'll see you all very soon.